At 2:22 p.m., I shut my laptop without slamming it. By 3:07, the silence I left behind was louder than any argument I could have made. And suddenly, the clause they ignored had a pulse. The conference room smelled faintly of overbrewed coffee and polished wood, the scent of decisions made too quickly and defended too long. Sunlight slid across the glass table like a spotlight, catching the silver edge of his resume packet as if it were a trophy. "He has a Wharton MBA. Accept it," HR said, the sentence landing with the confidence of someone who'd never stayed past 7 p.m. to reconcile numbers that refused to reconcile themselves. I didn't answer immediately, not because I was stunned. I had seen this choreography before, but because timing matters. In finance, in contracts, in life, you don't speak when emotion peaks. You speak when silence weighs more. Across the table, he smiled, polite, measured, the kind of smile that has been trained in networking receptions and alumni mixers. His cufflinks glinted when he adjusted his watch, as if even time had been curated for him. "Her team will support," someone added, not looking at me. That was the first crack. My team, the same team that had carried the last quarter when projections slipped and suppliers stalled, the same team that had worked through weekends while he was still a line item on a recruitment deck. Yet now I was being reframed, not as the architect of the recovery, but as scaffolding. I folded my hands on the table. "Who will be signing the loan covenant amendment?" I asked lightly. A pause, short, harmless on the surface. "We're not amending it," the CFO said. "We're fine." The air shifted, just a degree, enough. Because buried in Section 7.4 of that agreement, the one negotiated on a storm-heavy Tuesday 12 months ago, was a key person clause. My name wasn't ornamental there. It wasn't honorary. It was structural. But I didn't say that. Instead, I watched, the way HR avoided my eyes. The way the new hire's confidence flickered for a fraction of a second. Not doubt exactly, but unfamiliarity. He hadn't read the full covenant. Why would he? That wasn't in the MBA syllabus. "I'm sure she'll ensure continuity," someone added, trying to soften the transition. Continuity. Such a gentle word for displacement. My pulse didn't spike. It steadied. There is a particular calm that arrives when the inevitable finally introduces itself. You stop arguing with gravity. You start calculating trajectory. "I see," I said. No raised voice, no visible bruise. A notification vibrated on my phone. Treasury asking for updated liquidity projections. The irony was almost poetic. Numbers still trusted me, even if people didn't. He leaned forward then. "I'm looking forward to learning from you during the transition." Transition. There it was, official, unceremonious, wrapped in professional courtesy. I held his gaze just long enough for him to realize I wasn't intimidated, just assessing. "And when does that begin?" I asked. "Immediately," HR answered. The word felt colder than it should have. Glass walls make everything visible, yet nothing transparent. Outside the room, analysts typed, phones rang, interns hurried past with spreadsheets like fragile glass. Business as usual, always business as usual. Until it isn't. I nodded once. Understood. No one asked if I agreed. That was the second crack. They mistook composure for compliance. They mistook silence for surrender. And in doing so, they forgot something critical. Contracts do not care about charisma. At 2:17 p.m., the meeting dissolved into calendar invites and polite goodbyes. At 2:19, HR sent a follow-up email summarizing leadership evolution. At 2:21, I opened the loan covenant one more time, not to reread it, but to confirm what I already knew. Section 7.4, Key Person Clause. Trigger conditions. Lender notification requirement within 1 business day of material change. Material change. There are phrases that hum quietly until someone touches the wire. At 2:22 p.m., I shut my laptop, not dramatically, not angrily, just definitively. A junior analyst looked up. "Are you heading out?" "Yes," I said. "I am." He blinked, confused. "But the liquidity call will need to be rescheduled." The hallway felt longer than usual. Every step echoed against polished floors that had witnessed promotions, terminations, celebrations with supermarket champagne. Today, they carried something else, a quiet withdrawal of oxygen. In the elevator, my reflection stared back at me. Not defeated, not furious, clear. If they believed leadership was a diploma framed on a wall, they were about to discover the difference between credentials and covenants. Outside, the air was crisp. A delivery truck idled at the curb. Somewhere above, in an office with too much glass and too little foresight, a document lay unopened in someone's inbox, the one that would turn a routine reshuffle into a financial event. I didn't call anyone. I didn't warn anyone. I simply followed protocol. Because sometimes the loudest move is the one fully compliant with the rules. By 2:45 p.m., Treasury had escalated the postponed call. By 2:58, someone finally searched the term Key Person Clause in the covenant file. And by 3:07, the CFO's office went very, very quiet. If you think this was the turning point, you're wrong. This was only the moment they realized there was a lever. They still had to decide whether to pull it, or admit they never understood the machine they were operating, and what happened next would determine not just who held the title, but who actually held the company together. Some decisions can be reversed, others activate consequences the second you stand up from the table. At 3:07 p.m., the silence in the executive corridor wasn't dramatic. It was surgical. The CFO had closed his door, not loudly, not urgently, just enough to signal that whatever he'd seen on his screen required oxygen and privacy. A junior controller stood outside with a folder, waiting, unaware that inside that office, a single paragraph had shifted the balance of power. Section 7.4, Key Person Clause. The words looked harmless, almost ceremonial. Until you read the subtext, a material change in designated financial leadership required lender notification within 1 business day. Failure to notify constituted technical default. Technical default allowed the lender to review terms. Review allowed repricing. Repricing meant interest adjustments. Adjustments meant cost, real cost, and the company's margins were already thin from last quarter's volatility. Inside that room, someone finally understood. At 3:12, my phone lit up for the first time. Unknown extension. I let it ring, not out of spite, out of clarity. The boundary had been drawn at 2:22. If they needed me, they would need me properly. By 3:15, Treasury had attempted to access my risk models. They were comprehensive, documented, cross-referenced, but interpretation requires authorship. Numbers are obedient. Context is not. Another call, this time from HR. I watched it vibrate across the kitchen counter of my apartment, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. The quiet here felt different from the office quiet. This one belonged to me. They hadn't considered this angle. Not truly. In their narrative, I was a role, not a covenant condition. At 3:19, the CFO called directly. That was faster than I expected. I answered on the 4th ring. "Can you talk?" he asked, skipping pleasantries. "I'm available," I said evenly, a breath on the other end. Controlled, but thinner than usual. There appears to be a clause we need to discuss. Appears? As I mentioned in prior negotiations, I replied gently, the loan covenant specifies lender notification upon material leadership change. A pause, papers shuffling. Yes, about that. We're evaluating whether this qualifies as material. The word evaluating stretched like elastic over something already snapping. Replacing the named financial signatory in a leveraged structure? I asked calmly. It's difficult to argue immaterial. He didn't disagree. Outside his office, the leadership team was likely piecing the timeline together. My departure at 2:22, the covenant review at 3:07. Coincidence has a way of looking deliberate when you read the documents closely. We may need you to assist with continuity, he said. Assist. Earlier, I had been told to accept. Now, I was being asked to assist. The air between those two verbs contained an entire education. What exactly would that entail? I asked. We'd like to avoid triggering lender review. Avoid? I could tighten terms. No one wanted that could tighten terms. No one wanted that headline. Has notification been sent? I asked. No. That single syllable held more vulnerability than anything else said all day. Because delay has consequences, and lenders dislike surprises more than they dislike risk. I would strongly recommend proactive disclosure, I said carefully, accompanied by a structured transition plan. Silence, then quieter. Can you come back in? We need to align. There it was, not bring her back yet, but close enough to hear the echo forming. I looked around my apartment. The stillness felt earned. My calendar for the rest of the week had just been rewritten without my consent, yet somehow the leverage now sat with me. Before I consider that, I said, I need clarity on my role. Another pause. Titles matter less than authority. Authority matters less than documentation. The role remains yours, he said finally. There was miscommunication. Miscommunication, the corporate word for miscalculation. Outside, clouds had gathered over the city, dulling the skyline into silver gray. Stormlight, the kind that makes buildings look both fragile and monumental at once. Then I'll need written confirmation, I replied, and alignment with the board. Not revenge, not spectacle, just structure. Because once you understand that your value is written into binding agreements, you stop negotiating from emotion. He exhaled slowly. Understood. When the call ended, I placed my phone face down on the table. 5 minutes later, an internal memo was drafted. 10 minutes later, HR requested an urgent recalibration meeting. By 3:42, someone had quietly removed the announcement email from the scheduled send queue. And at 3:55, the CFO sent a message to the board. We are reviewing leadership transition timing in light of covenant considerations. Timing. Such a delicate word for damage control. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't exposed anyone. I hadn't even stepped back into the building. All I had done was understand the machinery. But here's what they still didn't grasp, and what would become painfully clear before the week ended. The clause wasn't just about my presence. It was about trust. Lenders don't price personalities. They price reliability. And if the board began to question who truly anchored financial strategy, the MBA on paper would not be enough to steady the conversation. By early evening, my inbox held 3 meeting invites labeled urgent. I declined the first 2, accepted the third. Because leverage isn't used impulsively, it's applied precisely. If you think this was the moment they regained control, you're underestimating what happens when documentation meets ego. The next decision wouldn't be about replacing me. It would be about explaining why they tried. And once that question enters a boardroom, it rarely leaves quietly. Some companies survive market shocks. Fewer survive credibility shocks. What unfolded after 307 would not be undone with a simple correction. And not everyone at that table would walk away unchanged. If you've ever been underestimated in a room full of credentials, tell me, would you have walked out at 2:22 too? The boardroom at 8:30 a.m. felt different from the conference room the day before, less performative, more exposed. Overnight, the sky had cleared, and morning light spilled through the tall windows with uncomfortable honesty. The city below moved with its usual indifference. Traffic flowing, deals closing, coffee being poured, unaware that on the 42nd floor, credibility was under review. I arrived precisely on time. Not early, not late. Precision matters when people are watching for weakness. The new hire was already seated, posture impeccable, a leather notebook open in front of him. He looked composed, but there was something new in his stillness. Awareness. Someone had explained the loan covenant to him, likely in a tone that no longer sounded celebratory. The CFO stood by the screen, remote in hand. "We appreciate everyone making time on short notice," he began, voice measured. "We are here to ensure alignment regarding financial leadership and lender obligations." Alignment. Such an elegant substitute for correction. I took my seat. No one introduced me. No one needed to. The presentation began with performance metrics, revenue stabilization, cost containment, liquidity buffers, slides I had built, models I had stress-tested, strategies I had defended when optimism tried to outrun arithmetic. The board members nodded slowly. Then came the slide, Loan Covenant Overview. The words seemed heavier this morning. "As you know," the CFO continued, "our agreement includes a key person clause tied to the Chief Financial Officer designation. Designation, not personality. Not resume. Designation." Eyes shifted toward me, then toward him. A board member adjusted her glasses. Was this considered before announcing transition? There it was, not accusatory, not dramatic, just precise. The room cooled by several degrees. "We were evaluating options," HR offered carefully. "Evaluating. Again." The chairwoman leaned back slightly. "Options are valuable. Defaults are not." Silence expanded like ink in water. I didn't speak, not yet. The new hire cleared his throat. "I want to clarify that my intention was to support and enhance existing structures." Support. Enhance. He was smart enough to recalibrate tone. But smart isn't the same as seasoned, and this room recognized the difference. The CFO shifted the slide. A timeline appeared. 2:22 p.m. departure. 3:07 p.m. covenant review. 3:55 p.m. board notification. Timestamps are unforgiving. "Had notification not been issued within the required window," he said, "we could have faced lender scrutiny." Could have. The phrase hung in the air like a near miss on a highway. No collision, but everyone felt the speed. A board member leaned forward. Why was this not flagged earlier? The question wasn't about the clause. It was about judgment. I watched HR's posture tighten. "We assumed continuity," she said. Assumed? That was the third crack. Assumptions work in marketing. They do not work in covenants. Finally, I spoke. "My role in the loan covenant was negotiated during refinancing," I said evenly. "The lenders required named financial oversight due to restructuring risk exposure. The clause reflects that requirement. No embellishment, no emotion, just record." "And removing that designation," the chairwoman asked quietly, "would have required lender consent?" "Yes," I answered. The new hire's pen stopped moving. This wasn't about hierarchy anymore. It was about institutional memory. The CFO exhaled slowly. The proposed transition will be paused pending lender consultation. Paused, not canceled. Strategically phrased to preserve dignity. The chairwoman studied the room. We cannot afford credibility erosion, not internally, not externally. There it was again. Credibility. More fragile than capital. Harder to replenish. A subtle shift occurred then, not in policy, but in perception. The board wasn't merely evaluating a staffing decision. They were evaluating stewardship. The new hire met my eyes briefly. Not defensive now, curious. He was beginning to understand that leadership is less about ascension and more about weight-bearing capacity. The meeting continued with risk mitigation steps, communication protocols, contingency planning, words layered over tension like careful stitching. But beneath it all, one truth pulsed. The attempt to reposition me had exposed fault lines no one intended to reveal. When the session adjourned, the chairwoman lingered. "I appreciate your composure yesterday," she said quietly to me. Composure. Another word that meant calculation. "I appreciate clarity," I replied. She nodded once. "So do our lenders." As people filtered out, HR avoided my gaze entirely. The new hire approached. "I underestimated the structural implications," he admitted, voice lower now. There it was, the first unvarnished sentence. "Structure rarely announces itself," I said. "It simply holds, until it's removed." He gave a faint, thoughtful smile. Not the networking smile. A real one. Back in my office, the air felt steadier. But something had changed, not the title, not the salary, the narrative. They would think twice before equating pedigree with preparedness again. Yet the story wasn't finished, because a lender consultation meant disclosure. Disclosure meant questions. And questions, once asked formally, have a way of traveling beyond the boardroom. By noon, an email draft was circulating for lender notification. Transparent, controlled, strategic. But transparency invites scrutiny. And scrutiny sometimes reveals more than intended. If the lenders chose to probe deeper into governance stability, the board would need more than a paused transition. They would need reassurance, and reassurance requires more than documentation. It requires proof. What happened next would determine whether this episode became a footnote or a signal. And signals in finance are rarely ignored. By late afternoon, the lender call was scheduled, not postponed, not softened, scheduled. The invitation carried a familiar neutrality. Discussion of leadership alignment and covenant compliance. No adjectives, no panic, just precision. The kind that suggests everyone already knows this is delicate. I reviewed the draft disclosure one last time before it was sent. Every word mattered, too defensive, and it implied instability. Too casual, and it suggested negligence. Balance, again. Across the hall, the new hire's office door was closed. Through the frosted glass, I could see movement, pacing. The confident rhythm from yesterday had shifted into something more introspective. Not collapse, recalibration. The CFO stopped by my doorway. "We'll position this as strategic continuity," he said quietly. "No abrupt transitions. Position. In markets, positioning determines outcome before execution even begins." "And governance oversight?" I asked. "Strengthened," he replied without hesitation. "Good. Because lenders don't fear change. They fear surprises layered over poor judgment." The call began at 4 p.m. 3 lender representatives joined. Calm voices, analytical cadence, no visible concern, which made it more serious. "Thank you for the transparency," one of them said after the opening summary. "We noted the key person clause in the loan covenant. Can you confirm there has been no material change to designated financial leadership?" A clean question. "Yes," the CFO said, "there has been no executed change." Executed, not proposed, not discussed. Executed, the distinction held. "And the board remains aligned on governance stability?" another lender asked. All eyes turned toward me, though no one said my name. "Yes," I answered evenly. "Oversight remains intact. Strategic continuity is maintained." Silence followed, not awkward, but evaluative. Lenders measure tone as much as data. Finally, "Understood. We appreciate proactive communication. Please notify us should formal restructuring occur." Not a reprimand, but not an endorsement either. The call ended. Exhalations circled the room almost in unison. Crisis avoided, but something subtler lingered. The chairwoman spoke first. "We need a governance review. Not reactive, preventative." HR shifted in her seat. A governance review meant documentation, process mapping, decision trails, email timestamps. It meant retracing the steps that led to yesterday's near miss. It meant accountability without theatrics. Later that evening, as most of the floor emptied, I remained at my desk. The city lights blinked awake one by one, reflections scattering across the glass like distant constellations. An internal memo arrived from the board. Effective immediately, all executive role transitions subject to covenant-linked review prior to announcement. Procedural, formal, binding. No one was being publicly corrected, but everyone understood. I leaned back, letting the quiet settle. There's a peculiar satisfaction in stability restored, not because you won, but because the system recalibrated. My phone buzzed, a message from the new hire. "Would you be open to collaborating on a revised strategic model? I'd value your perspective." Perspective, not mentorship, not oversight, collaboration. I considered the request carefully. This wasn't about ego anymore. It was about architecture. "I'm available tomorrow at 10, I replied. The response came quickly. "Thank you." Outside, rain began tapping against the windows. Soft at first, then steadier. The kind of rain that doesn't storm, but persists. Reputation works the same way. It's not built in dramatic declarations. It's built in quiet consistency, in clauses negotiated, risks anticipated, calls answered without tremor. The governance review commenced the following week. Policies were updated, escalation protocols clarified, board oversight reinforced, no headlines, no spectacle, just reinforced foundations. And yet, the tremor of that 45-minute window, from 2:22 to 3:07, would not be forgotten. Because everyone had felt how close the edge truly was, and edges, once seen, are never entirely invisible again. The organization would move forward. But now, when someone said he has a Wharton MBA, the room would no longer nod automatically. They would ask a different question. What does the covenant say? The story did not end with applause. It ended with documentation. 3 weeks later, the governance review concluded with a quiet board resolution, formal reaffirmation of financial oversight authority, mandatory covenant impact analysis for executive transitions, and a revised escalation framework signed by every member of leadership. No drama, just signatures. The office felt different, not tense, not celebratory, recalibrated. Conversations had shifted tone. Titles were mentioned less frequently. Responsibilities were discussed more precisely. When someone proposed an initiative, the next question was no longer, who supports this? But what does it trigger? Language had matured. One afternoon, the chairwoman stopped by my office again. The late sun painted long gold bands across the carpet, turning ordinary furniture into something almost theatrical. "You handled this with restraint," she said. "Restraint. It sounds passive. It isn't. Restraint is choosing structure over spectacle." "I handled it within the agreement," I replied. She smiled faintly. "That's exactly the point." After she left, I opened the original loan covenant one more time. Section 7.4, the key person clause. The paragraph that had quietly shifted leverage without a single raised voice. I remembered the negotiation 12 months earlier. Lenders cautious, projections under scrutiny, market volatility humming in the background like distant thunder. They had asked for reassurance. I had offered structure. Back then, the clause felt like protection. Now, it felt like proof. The new hire knocked lightly on my door. He no longer entered with rehearsed confidence. He entered with focus. "The revised strategic model is ready," he said. "I integrated your stress scenarios." Integrated, another word that meant evolution. We sat across from each other, not adversaries, not rivals, two professionals examining a framework designed to hold weight. "I was wrong about something," he admitted after a moment. I looked up. "I thought leadership was acceleration," he continued. "Turns out it's load-bearing." The metaphor landed cleanly. "Acceleration without structure collapses," I said. He nodded. There was no bitterness left in the room, only clarity. By the end of the quarter, performance stabilized. Lenders remained neutral, which in finance is the closest thing to praise. The governance memo became part of onboarding materials for future executives, a case study in what not to overlook. HR adapted too. Announcements became slower, more deliberate. Reviewed not just for optics, but for implications. The phrase, "Have we checked the covenant?" entered regular vocabulary. No one credited me publicly. No one needed to. Reputation had already absorbed the moment, and sometimes that is the most enduring outcome, not recognition, but recalibrated respect. On a quiet evening, long after most lights had gone dark, I paused by the window overlooking the city. Traffic glowed in red and white threads below, weaving patterns that only made sense from a distance. At 2:22 p.m. that day, I hadn't staged an exit. I had honored a structure. At 3:07 p.m., the system revealed who understood it. Power, I realized, is rarely in the title. It lives in preparation, in foresight, in clauses negotiated when no one is watching. I shut down my computer, gently this time, and gathered my coat. The building hummed softly behind me, steady and intact. Not because someone had the right diploma, but because someone had read the fine print and made sure it meant something.